Excellent. Well, thank you for the invitation and the opportunity to speak. I'll start sharing the screen now, which gets that moving along. So I'll be talking about energy efficiency and sustainability in places of worship, and considerations and options for retrofit, probably looking at carbon and energy in its widest sense. Myself, I'm a chartered building surveyor. I've been with Historic Environment Scotland, or Historic Scotland as it was until 2015, for 16 years or so, and before then I was a building contractor sort of in the Perth area, and I'm an elder of our church down here in the Scottish borders in Hobkirk, so I've had a bit of exposure to some of these questions, but it's quite a fast-moving environment, and I'll go through a few thoughts and considerations. I'll be deliberately quick because I think it's probably better that we get the feedback from the group rather than you hear me droning on about endless pictures. So I'll be quick, but really just to get you thinking. So just by way of overview then, a series of factors and considerations in how you might approach reducing the energy use in your buildings. And as I said, energy and carbon in its widest sense, which is more than operational energy alone. I will look at options you might have for upgrade, and we've got Louisa here to keep me right on the listed building consent side of life, and I'm comfortable that quite a few of the options that I'll be considering are what you might call LBC compliant up to a point, but it's all very context specific, so I wouldn't want to get into any big generalizations. I'll give a sniff of refurbishment principles, so how Hess sort of views the refurbishment landscape. I have an example of a building in Edinburgh. It's a detached sort of two-story cottage where we got some very good results from some refurbishment, and I'll just share with you again quite quickly what some of those fabric measures look like as I rattle through. And then I'll finish with an example of a church that we supported some measures on, really in terms of the heating, to give you an idea of options for the provision of thermal comfort. So Church of Scotland, and indeed many other denominations in Scotland, have a whole range of building stock, and I think probably most of it is early to late 19th century, generally quite big, high volumes, built for large numbers of people, where to some degree all the kilowatts from those folk did a degree of the heating. As we know, the situation is now very different. This is my church down in Hobkirk, about 1864, category B listed, and as you can imagine, we don't really fill that church full anymore very often. So lots to think about there. It's slightly ironic that the generation of churches that building, and indeed many others, replaced, what you might call the Reformation era or just after it, were a hell of a lot smaller. And some of us might be thinking, why don't we just stay in the smaller ones? Life might have been a little easier. However, we're not going to go back to that, so that's just the place where we're at. And obviously we need to work it out. Otherwise, we could end up in a situation where the buildings are no longer practicable. So what should we be thinking about? And it's very easy in the energy landscape to rush straight to measures. And in fact, we've been pushing quite hard. What's the condition? If the building fabric is not in good condition, i.e. is the building dry, are the walls dry, whatever you do energy-wise will always be pushing a large rock up a hill, and it always running back down over your feet again. So building condition is a factor. There's many technical questions in maintenance and upgrade of large masonry structures. particularly churches that stick up and catch every drop of rain going. But we've got answers for that, maybe as part of a separate discussion. How is it used and by who and by how often? If you have a large building that's only used once a week, your approach should perhaps be less about the fabric and more in about how you heat it and to what level, unless you're going to have more frequent use. Otherwise, these measures are just not going to be cost effective. And also the scale and the nature of the building. Is it a big church in an urban context, something slightly smaller in a rural environment, a chapel, or indeed a church hall? And a lot of you will be responsible for ancillary buildings, vestries, church halls, even manses, where we're pretty much in what you could call the domestic space. And in the domestic space, the measures start to make a whole lot more sense. And we've got a wide palette of interventions for traditional buildings and those with protection, either listing or in conservation areas. We need to think what the existing heating and ventilation arrangements are. Often, many of you will have legacy heating equipment, which is probably obsolete and maybe lingering along on its last legs. And you're quite rightly thinking, right, what do we do now? We need to do something. We also know that the legislation regarding gas boilers is changing. So there may be opportunities in this repair cycle to consider. And what is the actual issue? Is it a heating issue, or indeed, as may be happening in parts of the UK and certainly Europe, is it going to be a cooling issue? I put that in for devilment, really, because I think in Scotland we are thinking about heating, really, and the cooling is probably less of one, but it is a factor. And indoor air quality, and particularly the lessons that we've learned or identified from COVID-19, will have to be a factor in life going forward. And of course, there is the expectation of the congregation in terms of their perceptions of thermal comfort, and there will be an ongoing discussion about that. And then finally, what options do you have? Do you have, would you have the funds for this? What is the nature of your tenure of the building, and how much can you actually do given the constraints? So a whole range of mixtures. Hess have had quite a bit of experience in the supply of energy, the management of the provision of heat, which was really staff related. And in fact, Edinburgh Castle, they saved 20% on their energy bills by changed staff behaviour alone. So if you are using your building quite intensively, staff behaviours are a big part of it, and that's perhaps a separate lecture to dwell on. But I'll just quickly go through some areas where we've had good results in buildings and indeed some churches. So secondary glazing is up there, depending on which side that could be. Floor insulation is relevant, as is various types of wall insulation. Again, I suspect in a church context that is limited, but the option is there, possibly in ancillary buildings. Roofs and lofts, as you can identify. Access and safety in ceilings has been a big issue with the Church of Scotland in the last few years, and again, it goes along with the wider obligation and appreciation of what you have and how you deal with it. Heating that suits the nature of the space, and generally, in my experience, and if Andrew McCowan is on the call, for high volume structures, filling them with warm air is very expensive and time consuming, and therefore radiant heat options might be more suitable. I touched on ventilation, again, depending on the numbers you have, but also I'd like to emphasize wider embodied carbon considerations. So in our view of this, it is not just about reducing operational energy to the lowest possible level, because in doing that, you utilize materials, some of which are quite carbon intensive. So it is looking at the wider carbon story in this, including how you might offset certain elements of carbon with energy storage and smart procurement, what is sometimes called grid balancing. Scotland now has a surplus of green electricity at certain times, and the key to energy policy going forward is how do you store that energy when you have the peak, so that you can use it when various aspects of green energy generation are not producing the goods in the same way. So energy storage, I think, is going to be quite an important thing in the domestic sector, and also in that of wider organisations going forward, such as your presbyteries or Kirk sessions, and indeed buildings. COVID-19 will change how we consider the indoor environment. I think that's it's early days on that, but I'm fairly certain it will happen. And then, of course, we've got to fit all those options at the moment under the banner of the Energy Performance Certificate, the EPC, and the requirement for net zero. And we've had a bit of experience at the domestic scale with the Energy Performance Certificate, and certain things it kind of likes, if that's not being flippant with it, and certain things that are not always recognised by the software that sits behind it. And obviously, as Judith mentioned, there is a requirement for net zero on buildings, and many organisations have effectively signed up for that commitment. And in terms of retrofit, my view, or my fairly strong view, is that the means don't always, the end does not always justify the means. And if in producing a incredibly airtight, energy efficient building, we put a significant amount of material and carbon to landfill, where it biodegrades, produces methane, and contributes to the carbon, to the atmospheric problems in another way. So we're very much looking at minimizing waste, but adding to the fabric and doing things in that way. And I'll touch on some of these measures later on. I think, however, we have to accept that in many ecclesiastical properties, your options for intervention are actually very limited, given the nature of the internal fitting, the volume I've spoken about, the amount of glazed area, and the nature of that glazing. And even sometimes in some of the older buildings, your floor might be a little off limits because there are burials underneath the floor too. So I think we are going to be looking quite hard at the nature of the heat and the nature of the energy that you use to deliver that heat, and looking at making the carbon savings and the offsetting possibly in different areas. This is not a get out of jail free card or an excuse not to do anything, but it is acknowledgement that the nature of the building fabric of some of the properties that you will be interacting with. And of course, it's also about the available funds that you have as Kirk Session or presbyteries, or indeed other administrative arrangements within the denominations, as to how you fund that. What are your paybacks going to be? And indeed, what is the grants landscape, which I am very much not an expert on at all. But to give you an idea as to where my thinking goes in the pilots that we've been running, and Hess has been running pilots mainly in the refurbishment of domestic buildings since 2008. And I can forward links in due course for those who want to read up on that. I don't want to bombard you with too much, so I'll keep to the kind of ecclesiastical script. But the thinking at the moment, and it's kind of evolved, is that you've got the good condition that I've mentioned, protecting the embodied carbon that's already there. You've considered climate change adaptation and the fact that we're getting more rain, and some of the rain that we're getting is more intense. And some of you will remember the weather we had on Sunday evening and afternoon, which probably was overwhelming much of the building fabric, and to a degree, if your rainwater goods weren't in tip-top condition, you'd have had water where you weren't planning to have it. And this includes fabric adjustments. The measures that you look at are technically compatible, and that's really about the breathability of traditional fabric, because if you get that right, your repair will last and work well. If you choose not to do it that way, you may find the place starts to smell a bit differently, and you might find your plaster starts to spool and do funny things, and spots of rust appear on corners, and your overall performance of that fabric is not what it should be. You're trapping moisture, basically. Upgrade of the existing fabric elements. So you may remember that skip image I showed you just a second ago. We're looking at adding to those elements to make them perform better, not removing them, putting them to landfill, and having something new in its place that may have quite a high embodied footprint, depending on where it comes from and what it's made from. And that the installed measures are equivalent of the lifetime of the building. I have very little interest in products with a 10-year guarantee. I'm not even convinced by the validity of guarantees. They are dependent on the capacity of the organisation to pay an insurance premium. It doesn't necessarily represent quality or durability. So in the sort of measures that we're doing, I'm expecting 70, 100 years plus, because once they're in, why should they not perform any different to the rest of the building fabric? In the wider sustainability argument, we need to be morally appropriate clients, i.e. sustainable sourcing. And indeed, if we get the right materials in retrofit, we can contribute to carbon capture by using grown materials, as opposed to materials that use oil feedstock in their production. And that ventilation and indoor air quality addressed, maximizing health and resilience of the occupants. And that will be an ongoing theme, that the measures are proportionate, do what is practicable, what is reasonable. This is possibly what you might call the law of diminishing returns and the 80%, 20% discussion in performance that applies to many natural systems. Obviously, the measures need to achieve the energy standards and reduce the operational carbon. So we can't get around that. But I think with the results that we've had, that is achievable to a reasonable degree. But appreciating that low carbon technologies, particularly zero carbon heating, can address the operational carbon limits that I have to admit that many older buildings will always reach. There'll be a point beyond which, in terms of the energy fabric performance, you'll find it very hard to get any less with the budgets and the time and the constraints that we have on the building stock that we've described. But I think low carbon technologies, low carbon heat, energy capture, and smart procurement from the grid is probably going to be one of the ways where organizations are able to do more offsetting to make up for that limitation in the operational performance. And I've been coining a term recently called conservation retrofit, where essentially we are taking a slightly lighter touch, but one that gives, I would argue, better, wider results for the environment and society. If it's less invasive, it'll cost less and you're more likely to do it. If it's less invasive, there's less disruption. You have slightly lower operational performance, but you have less waste going to landfill. You're upgrading what you have, and you retained embodied carbon by less removal of the material. Less removal means less replacement stuff. And the upgraded materials, as I touched on, can sequester carbon capture. And keep it low tech. It'll probably last a lot longer, and you won't have a redundant system that you're having to replace in 15, 20 years. And there's quite a few stories of that around. And also don't feel that you necessarily have to do it all at once. That'll depend on your maintenance cycles, access to funds, and other operational programs that will depend on the resources of your congregation. In the domestic context, there's an interesting program called Zero Optimise Retrofit in Wales. The Welsh Government are sponsoring it, whereby the retrofit of housing is looked at in phases and waves that aligns to existing maintenance requirements and obligations. So the energy work is not done in isolation to the other construction activity, which has to happen on all buildings at appropriate intervals. I won't dwell on this slide too much, but here is your average traditional building. 1.5-story cottage, sort of generic Scottish example, with a range of options by where we've intervened. And I'll look at some of these in a little bit more detail. Glazing, masonry, roofs, floors, windows, doors, and indeed micro-renewables, which can help in the offsetting. So maybe refer to the detail of that later. So the example that I'm going to canter through some of the measures on is a building called the Holyrood Park Lodge. It's part of Historic Environment Scotland's portfolio. Until recently, it was the exhibition centre and the shop for the Holyrood Park. It is category B listed and sits within the World Heritage Site. And you can see it's quite a Gothic gingerbread type cottage, quite a complicated, not complex, but a busy roof plan with angles and things coming out. It started its life as an EPC Band F, and we finished work fairly recently with an EPC Band C, and that's without changing the boiler. So we're hoping that with renewables we might be able to achieve Band B, and with offsetting and some of the other wider factors that I discussed, maybe the upper end of a B, or possibly better. I'm speculating now, and I must stop at that point. But that's quite a modest impact on the building fabric, but we got some very good results from the EPC, partly because we spent quite a bit of time and money on paying the EPC inspector, the person who's doing the assessment, to take cognizance of what we've done and to look at things, and we're able to evidence what we've done. Often EPCs fall down in commercial buildings, in domestic buildings, because the owner or the occupier can't demonstrate what the building actually is. So therefore the assessor has to make a series of default assumptions. That may be because he's in a hurry, because he's not getting paid very much, or because they don't have the evidence to back up what the assessor needs to know. So if you're thinking about this, try and have as much evidence that you can show them, so that the person who's doing the assessment is able to see specification for the floor insulation, for example, because they can't see it. They're not allowed to lift the floorboards or punch holes in the attic roof, in the attic, to have a look. And for the real detail of this, I've got the link there on the PowerPoint slide there. It's online. It'll give you all sorts of additional details. But conscious of time, and just to fly through some of the measures, so you've got a feeling for what I actually mean by some of the measures we're talking about. That's just, there we go. So generally, I start at the bottom in my mind. So this is the floor that was lifted, wood fibre put between the existing joists, and we salvaged some of the floorboards, and then obviously, as you can see on the left there, that's a new floorboard going in, and that's how the salvage section looks. So it went back down quite nicely. Lovely colour. And you can see the somebody's feet there as they finish something else off. If you have warm feet, you will feel much warmer and more comfortable, and therefore your desire and need for high temperatures around your nose will be less, because your feet are warm. You'll be thermally more comfortable. So a little bit of body physiology coming in there as well, in terms of how we experience and perceive thermal comfort. We looked at the glazing too. The existing windows were dated from 1995. They were single glazed, and we got consent for improved glazing that went into the existing sashes. Again, this is a domestic context, so not necessarily church buildings are suitable for this. We did draft stripping as well, which worked reasonably well. And just to put the sort of the church question, here's the window at Hobkirk. These leaded lights, sometimes or with zinc cames, quite difficult to address. There are a lot of systems now for thermal upgrade of this, with various double glaze units on the inside quite often, and thermal breaks, so the gap in between doesn't overheat. But also you can have external polycarbonate secondary glazing, which is really as much about vandalism and protection from the elements, but you are still creating a form of thermal break That is a vented space. That carbonate is not tight to the masonry at all, nor it should be, but it's just giving you that layer. In terms of attics and roof spaces, we're a big fan of wood fibre or hemp fibre. Various grown materials now come in board or bat form, as they call it. Generally, bats are better because they've just got a little more flexibility, and you can fasten them between existing structural timbers, as you can see here, where the bats are held by the by the timber runner. This material actually comes from Austria, but there are several businesses starting up in Scotland where they're going to be using material grown in the UK and certainly Scotland, and there's a producer now moving into the market of this with a grown hemp, which is a great material for fast growing and carbon sequestration. This is the roof of a church hall that's been done, and that is some sheep's wool being fastened in between some fielded panels, and you can see the existing ceiling truss there. Sheep's wool is pretty good. There are sometimes insect protection measures that you need to consider with it, but an appropriate material, given that the current market for wool from shearing is, well, there's almost no market for it at all, to be honest. So it's appropriate we can reuse that material in some way. But there are considerations to be dwelt upon regarding the subject of Mr. Moth. So do think about that. Whoops, I jumped on. In terms of doors, and keeping on the theme of in situ upgrade rather than removal and disposal, there is a good material called aerogel, which lends itself to narrow, difficult to insulate areas, so that the material is about 10 millimeters thick, and that has been put into the fielded panel of the door. That's the cold bit, and held in place with the plywood sheet that you can see that's been cut round the lock mounting and some of the other details. You'll also notice that we've blocked up the letterbox because that was just a howling gale coming through there. So again, think of upgrading in situ as opposed to removal and replacement. To show the wall interventions, in this particular case in the lodge, we blew blown cellulose in behind the existing linings, and this might be an option for what we'll call internal wall insulation in some church halls or in some manses or in smaller areas. As I've said, with the main body of a large church building, I'm not entirely sure that wall insulation necessarily has a place, but all the other things, that the smaller buildings that you'll be operating, wall insulation will play a part, and it will be necessary probably to get a reasonable outcome for your EPC. And in this case, it was very easy to evidence it because we opened up the hatch, the little inspection hatch that we've done here, and the assessor was able to see the depth of the material that we've put in. This is actually a different building, but I show this just to give a kind of nice summary of the measures. So we insulated the floor with hemp bats, and you can see that the new boards on the floor, bottom left. We insulated the walls with blown material behind the existing linings. We actually even repaired the lath and plaster ceiling, and that had a hemp fibre board above that, and we had secondary glazing, which you can just make out on the staff beads on all the windows. And then that mirror there was a radiant panel, which gave a really nice sort of quite a natural feeling heat. The hearth we left, but the hood over that hearth is pressed in, and later hearths actually shut off. They have a damper incorporated in it, so in fact you're controlling the draft through the flue. We've always kept hearths in place in refurbishment, partly because of the aesthetics and the presentation of the room, but also more importantly for ventilation, because with secondary glazing or draft strip windows, or indeed more modern windows, where is your air coming from for you to breathe? Where are the products of off-gas and other emissions going to be going? And I think that's an often overlooked area refurbishment. And if you have hearths, that's a very convenient and appropriate way of addressing that. In terms of porches and open ceilings, just furthering to that example from the church hall, this is the rear hall in the lodge, and that's wood fibre between the roof trusses, so to speak, and they had plywood placed on top of them, and then that had a clay paint on it actually. And the second thing to notice in this image is the quarter light, bottom middle of this slide image, with its not terribly complex piece of technology to open and shut it. And the lodge, frankly, was never going to overheat very much, but we wanted to show that if you want to achieve good air circulation and cooling in areas where you may need it, the policy should be to take the hot air out of the higher area, and that draws in cooler air from the bottom. So passive ventilation works by warm air rising, and you let it out of the top. You'll say, well, why do I want to lose warm air? Well, when you've got 60 people in a ceilidh in a church hall, you most certainly want to lose that warm air. And if you apply considerations on COVID and infection, carbon dioxide levels, and other less friendly items, you will be under a burden to make sure that ventilation is working and effective. Many church halls have existing passive ventilation systems. All you need to do is unblock them. Here's an image of a reinstated hearth that we did in the lodge. This is not a big room. We've got a table and we have 10 chairs around it. If you've been in a meeting there, as me and my colleagues like to spend a lot of time doing, you will quickly find the air becomes very stuffy. So the hearth, as I said before, was a deliberate ventilation tool as a way of managing indoor air quality in the room. And also above that is a radiant panel, which just delivered just an extra boost to the heating for comfort. The snag with radiant panels, if they're secondary heating, SAP, Simplified Assessment Procedure, which is part of the EPC, will penalise you for secondary electric heating. So whereas in that cottage image I showed you, that was all radiant heating, so that was primary heating, that was absolutely fine for SAP. But secondary heating at the moment, the way the pricing is worked out, you will get a slight SAP penalty point or two. Moving onwards then, this shows the assessment team, the building monitoring team, who looked at the lodge and calculated a whole lot of building performance matters, including moisture movement and the U value, the insulation value that we achieved with the materials and the upgrade measures in place. So lots of wires, lots of monitoring, lots of counting, and that's described in detail in the case study that I can show you the link of later on. And just to show, this is our EPC, and it's the sort of upper end of a band, lower middle bit of the band C, which I think we're quite happy with, and options for much better with zero carbon boiler or zero carbon heating and renewables. Well, might get us yet further still. So that's the domestic example that we've finished fairly recently, and I've written up in some detail. And I think most of those measures will be appropriate for manses, for church halls, and smaller buildings. Might not be so good for the large churches, but we can perhaps discuss options with that. And then diving into a church example then, which is Kilmelford Church, just south of Oban. All the classic things that you will be familiar with. It was drafty and cold. The existing electrical heating system was inadequate and very old. The fuse box was antique. A long issue of damp and water penetration, as well as repair backlogs. So it was approached very strategically by a very motivated and capable Kirk Session, and they did a big package of repair work first. So the fabric was addressed, the right materials done in the right way, architecturally and technically appropriate. Apologies for my spilling there. And the real driver for this work was that the church was going to be used every day for childcare, for a nursery, and they were going to have bands and concerts at the weekend over and above the additional worship on the Sunday. So this building was going to be turned from a not used very often building to one that had everyday business in it all the time, nearly throughout the year. So the need to get this right was very high. I think if this church was going to stay for Sunday worship only, there might have been a slightly different approach. So they had help from the Church of Scotland in terms of they have an energy advisor, and then from Hess, me and my team, they got some money and a fair bit of thoughts and ideas on what they might do, and we delivered a program of radiant heat provision and an air source heat pump after the fabric work had been done. And that refurbishment case study is number 19, and the link is there. And the reason we're able to go into such detail in the planning stage was they had a quantity surveyor on the Kirk session, which kind of helped. And therefore there was a renewable study and some recommendations that the Kirk session were able to consider and take forward. And over that as well was the category B listing, which wasn't a massive factor, but certainly was in the mix. So that was the sort of the background to it. What did it look like? This is the church gable end facing the sea or facing the coastline, with a traditional lime flush finish, which went quite a long way to addressing the damp issues. So immediately you had drier air inside. Drier air is easier to make you feel warm in, easier to heat. Quite a lot of roof work and quite a lot of gable and verge detailing. So the outside skin was sorted out, the rainwater goods were working, and all that sort of business. The air source heat pump, they're quite big, ugly white things that sit on the side of buildings and hum away. Here it is on the corner of the B listed building that I've just mentioned, and obviously that had to go through the consent process with involvement and dialogue from Historic Environment Scotland and the local authority. So don't forget that your starting point in the journey of all this is almost invariably your local authority planning team. There may be a conservation officer, or there may be a planning officer who takes the lead on conservation matters. So generally that is your starting point in your deliberations. Sometimes they charge for discussions and sometimes they don't. So hold that thought. Inside, the air source heat pump produces warm air. In the case of Kilmelford, that was about 14 or 15 degrees through a kind of fan type thing. There were two of these, one on the edge of the mezzanine layer and then one slightly lower down in the building. So you had warm air coming in. The strategy for this was that this warm air alone would not be enough to make everybody feel warm and comfortable, but this ran pretty much 24/7, but it meant the baseline for warming up when the building was in use, which was generally daily, as I said, the radiant panels were able to take it up to the required comfort level that the congregation and the performers and the childcare arrangements needed. The radiant heaters in the chancel area, so up towards the altar, were these sort of curious black bands that sat just at ease level. They blended in perfectly, so there were really no significant visual issues as such. It might have put them a little bit lower down, obviously the further away, but the background heat produced by these was very comfortable indeed. And just to give you another example, this is the arrangement in Hobkirk, which is about as ugly as it gets, but they worked very well. And again, it's a balance of what does your congregation need. They are temporary, they are easily removable, minimal effect on the fabric. So maybe when things change, technology improves, it's the easy switch over. which I think is what I'm perhaps trying to show from this slide. But this is not Kilmelford. This is another church. The thing that worked very well at Kilmelford is they had a mezzanine layer, or what might have been a kind of elder's loft or laird's loft or something above, and the area below, they put the panel pointing downwards. So as soon as you came into the church through the door at the end of the gable, you had this kind of really warm feeling. And because the ceiling height here was quite modest, this is where all the children ended up gathering, because this was the warm, comfy part of the church. Not to say the rest of it wasn't warm and comfortable, but this was definitely quite high on the favoured list. And in fact, seating and various things started to develop around this hotspot. And then going forward, not the world's finest image, a bit grainy, but here is the architects envisioning for a solar PV array that could have been in the glebe, as it is shown here, so the ground adjacent. Some of you may have options for roofs, but that'll be a listed building question for later, possibly. The benefit of having them on the ground, of course, is you don't have the roof access issue. They can be kept clean. The maintenance is easily addressed. And in fact, you could have many more of them than are shown here. So this was to offset the electrical cost of the air source heat pump, which obviously has to run. It was done about, gosh, 8 years ago now. So the efficiency of all this stuff is improving all the time. I'm not saying the air source heat pump is the only game in town, but it was certainly an option that worked quite well in this particular case. So just drawing to a close now. At the moment, this purple document on the right there, short guide number 1, with the snappy title of Fabric Improvements for Energy Efficiency in Suburban Buildings, is out there, and that covers all the elements that I've discussed. But we also have a new one coming out, an updated version that considers perhaps the wider story in a bit more detail, embodied carbon and other factors. But all the measures that at the Lodge were there, I'm not saying LBC compliant is possibly a bit of a stretch, but the measures that we have described in this document have been done in many listed buildings. And there's the link to that at the bottom there. And then just to remind you, the case study for Kilmelford Church, case study number 19, is in that second link. So it's probably time for me to stop talking, to give you the glyphs and the symbology to describe our journey on this, and very happy to take questions and progress from there with Louisa as we need to.
Thank you, Roger. That was absolutely brilliant. There's loads and loads of information for us all to take in there. We've got a number of questions in the chat box. So if you're happy, I'm just going to read those and see if you can answer some of them. I don't know if you want to stop sharing screen just now, and then we'll be able to see everybody in the room as well.
That's right.
So we've got a mixture of things in here. So Richard Kilgour has put in a question. He says, our Zero Waste Scotland audit, was a church in Motherwell, indicated that greatest energy saving can be achieved with underfloor insulation to suspended floors in the church and the hall buildings. They have a contractor who's recommending a spray or foam insulation, but the architect has questioned the use of foam as perhaps not appropriate. Can you comment on how appropriate that would be for underfloor insulation?
Yeah, so I think the assessment was correct, is that the floor, particularly a suspended timber floor, is and we say floors first actually, so it's quite good that aligns. I'm not convinced that the foam is the answer. The reason it's popular is that it's done underneath and it's sprayed up. It depends on the nature of the foam as well. We'd want it a vapor open material, and I think we would be generally favouring a wood or a hemp fibre laid underneath the floor. There may not be crawl space for that. That might mean lifting floorboards, but I think that's kind of what you have to do. Spray materials are interesting. We've done it in walls behind existing linings, and it's been fine. but we've not tried it anywhere else because we've got other, and in our view, better options for that. So I think that's probably my feelings on that one.
Okay. John Collins is asking a quite similar question. His church has a loft, and he's asking whether sprayed foam on the underside of the loft roof would be a good idea.
This is a big no. I think it would definitely keep you warmer, no question, and it would definitely work. The snag is that quite a lot of insurers and mortgage people take fright at this measure specifically, mainly because in England slates and tiles are on battens, and it really kind of gets muddled up with the repairability of the roof. In Scotland, with our slates and things generally on sarking, it's not quite the same reason, but likewise I sort of default to what we've tried and tested in some of the images you saw, which is wood fibre, which you can move around if you need to, you can get access underneath if you need to, etc., etc. So it's not that it's necessarily evil and bad. It's just, I think we'd suggest that we've got a better way of doing it with a product that captures carbon, that can be done by your local joiner, and it's I would suggest a better story, a better measure.
Thank you. Mary Sweetland's put in a question about, are Historic Environment Scotland willing to accept polycarbonate secondary glazing on listed buildings?
I'll answer that. I suppose I've got a couple of preliminary points to make. Is that first off, all ecclesiastical buildings have ecclesiastical exemption. So that means that listed building consent is not required for alterations to churches. However, for churches that are still in use. However, most of the main denominations have signed up to a voluntary agreement, which means that they have agreed that they will seek listed building consent for external work. So I suppose the short message is that for most denominations, you should seek listed building consent from the local authority if you're doing external work. And the decision making is, I mean, HES would be consulted for if your church is listed at category B, A or B, but the ultimate decision is taken by the planning authority. And I suppose that there are, different planning authorities might take slightly different decisions in any particular case. And they might also, it also depends, these decisions are taken very much on the impact of that particular set of works on that individual building. As a general principle, we do accept polycarbonate in listed buildings in many cases. I thought that the image that Roger showed of secondary glazing on the outside of the window was not something that we would be very keen on seeing. There are occasions when that is necessary, but we're more likely to accept that in a situation where there is an argument in favour of if there's some sort of security issue, or if you have, for example, very valuable stained glass and you're in an area where there is a high risk of vandalism, for example. So that might be a reason for having that sort of secondary glazing externally. But I think that we would normally, I mean, as I said, with because listed building consent isn't required inside, that's not really an issue. But I think on the whole, it can generate secondary glazing like that, or including the use of polycarbonate, can be acceptable on the insides of listed buildings.
We've got a question from David Campbell, also asking about listed building. He's got our A-listed Coldingham Priory heats with underfloor heating fed by electric boilers. Would HES permit installation of air source heat pumps located adjacent to the piping and boiler location, but outside the front of the building? The heat pumps could be screened.
once again, this is, it's sort of the planning department will have a view on this. I think that we would want to see consideration given to where the pumps could be located in the most discrete location. So it's possible that that might be the front elevation. I'm not particularly familiar with Coldingham Priory, but I appreciate that there might be reasons why actually placing heat pumps in a different location would be potentially more damaging. But generally we would recommend going, as Roger showed in his slide, somewhere around the back or around the side, if at all possible. Screening is obviously, you know, would help a lot. And I suppose that if you were able to avoid attaching the units to the building at all, then that would also avoid the need for listed building consent. There might still be issues of planning, and I know at Coldingham, I think there's maybe kind of scheduled area around the building as well, which would be a entirely separate matter as well. So that's also something that you would have to consider in that case. But I think on the whole, we would want to help a congregation find a way of of finding a sensitive location for heat pumps if they felt that was the appropriate way of improving their energy efficiency.
Does that help, David?
Again, as Louisa implied, a heat pump doesn't have to be bolted to the wall. It's just often is, because that's where sort of heating engineers tend to put the stuff, because they've always done it that way. It could equally be put on something else. Of course, that's an additional cost. So it's really how you wish to do it.
We wouldn't want to put the fittings on the wall of the church. It would be a separate standing thing with pipes underground into the building.
I'm sure the Scottish Borders new conservation officer would be very interested to discuss your proposal in detail.
Thank you.
We've got a few questions about wool, putting wool into the buildings. So Sarah McCrory is asking us if there's a fire risk with hemp mats and sheep's wool.
These materials do have a fire rating. Most of them will combust, but they won't support combustion. So that's the same as anything else in your house generally. Other construction materials, as we know from the whole issue with EWI on some modern buildings, are in a different case. So we're pretty comfortable with wood fiber board, hemp board, because it's so dense. It's not something you can chuck in that you could light. It just doesn't do that. It isn't that. It has, and some of them also have retardants in them as well. But you'd have to check on the wool. I'm not entirely sure.
Okay. There's some questions around eco wool as well. How about eco wool? It's made from recycled plastic bottles, and we've got a comment from Peter Williamson talking about using that to insulate the church hall.
The snag with non-natural materials is they don't buffer humidity very well, and I'd suggest that there's a suite of natural materials available. I like the word eco wool. It's like implying it's cheap and it's ecological, but it's actually from plastic, which is, it's got its own story there. That'll certainly burn. So I would. It's not in our shopping list, and we haven't tried it, so I probably wouldn't comment.
Okay. Now, Miriam McQueen is looking for some advice about who to approach for an initial assessment of the building.
Yeah, very good question, and I think it's very easy to sort of hurtle into measures immediately, and sometimes you need a little bit of something where somebody steps back. Generally, for fabric and getting the sort of the technical side of it, I would suggest you want an architect or a surveyor, and possibly with a building conservation accreditation, which means they're kind of up on old fabric. They get the issues of vapor movement, dampness. They'll understand all that, and then the next stage, of course, which is the insulation work that you're thinking about. but the two probably have to be looked at together, particularly if there's some defects that have been kicking around for a while that need remedial work before you can start. The RIAS website, the Royal Corporation of Architects in Scotland, has accredited people on it, and the RICS website has accredited chartered surveyors on there too.
Okay, does that answer for you? Yep. There's a question from Donald Bruce again about asking, when you have a clash between potential reduced carbon emissions and historic or aesthetic criteria, who decides on the ethical value, which one has priority? And how do the regulations work on the ground here? What he's concerned about is the context of the present climate emergency, if historic factors generally tend to trump carbon reductions.
I don't entirely agree with that, because I think there are bigger factors than just low operational energy use. And I suspect, as we'll discover in the next 25 years or so, many of the things we did to reduce operational energy will be biting us in the bottom with unintended consequences, and indeed the operational carbon in it. But I think from what we've worked out is that generally we can reduce carbon quite significantly in existing buildings. And indeed, by keeping existing buildings, you're avoiding the outcomes of having to build new ones, which has its own carbon story. So I don't think it's necessarily quite such a black and white choice, but I do accept there are nuances. Perhaps Louisa can comment on the higher level morality.
Well, I don't know whether I can, but I think that listing exists to recognise the value of the architectural merit and historic value of our historic buildings, and that there are only, these are also a limited resource. So I think in any particular situation, clearly there are, there is a balance to be struck. Not addressing climate issues is also going to be damaging to the historic environment. So, and we want these buildings to continue to be in use and to be comfortable and for the people who use them. And not addressing issues makes that less likely. I think that there will be some situations where the historic value of a building may outweigh other considerations, but then this is quite a small proportion of buildings and parts of buildings in the grand scheme of things. So I think that generally what you would be weighing up is the value of the historic building and the impact of the measures that you would be putting in place, and quite what they are actually likely to achieve. So, but there's always a balancing act. There's always a balance to be struck, and that covers many things. In addition to climate, in addition to climate considerations, I suppose the listed building consent process forms part of that. That is there to ensure that weighing up process actually takes place. And
sometimes, let's call it traditional or historic options, can come to our rescue here. So, for example, in terms of external masonry and climate change, which means for most of us in Scotland a whole lot more rain. Smashing on the walls. Until about 1820 or thereabouts, most Scottish buildings had a covering on them that was quite often sort of lime washed and things. And that was a very durable way of stopping the water coming through. Changes in the 19th century in terms of how buildings were presented meant that increasingly went out of favour. And bits of our stone are falling off the faster for it. So external wall insulation of the right type, and again, of the right type, would address that. And also, you could argue, reinstate a finish that might be appropriate for that building anyway. So you could make some of these measures. You could have a conservation gain because you've addressed a defect, and also listed building consent is about managing change. So it does accept that change has to happen. It just seeks to manage it in the right way. There is a document I haven't subjected you all to, which is Short Guide 11, which talks about climate change adaptation and what we have to do to buildings to stop them getting wet and leaky and generally rubbish. And that accepts change in subtle but significant ways. And there's quite a few church examples in that, because I have many phone calls from people with damp towers, wet gable ends, and in fact Hobkirk was in that position too. And we've addressed that with some changes, and the gable doesn't look quite as it did before, but it's a whole lot drier and we're a whole lot happier. So I think there's a balance, and I think, yeah, we need to play our part and do stuff, but not go too far down the track too fast.
So what question was the fact that I'm, well, I worked for many years for the Church of Scotland running a project on ethics and technology, and therefore the whole question of how do you manage trade-offs on environmental issues, because there very often are, a gain in one place is offset by a loss in the other. But also the fact that I'm writing of advice for the Episcopal Church, and one of the questions is, you know, would we just be put off by historic Scotland or whatever? So very encouraging to hear your response. Thank you.
We've got a couple of questions around heating people really rather than buildings. So are there other ways we can heat people? And what about seat heaters?
Yes, Kilmelford had panels just in front of on the back of each pew, onto the sort of knees and calves of the person sitting. We did think about heated seats. Actually, we did with upholstery, heated upholstery, which is available. I'm not quite sure why that didn't happen, but the heated pews are definitely there. And I think that is correct. I think, and radiant heating seeks to warm the object that the radiant thing sits on and not the air. So your air may be at 15 degrees or so, maybe less, but your back, your neck is feeling warm. Of course, everyone says, well, that I just have a hot head and cold feet. So I think there's a multiple approach, but that's quite right. Maybe we should be focusing on the people.
Yeah.
As well.
Can I add a bit in there? I was just speaking to somebody earlier this afternoon, and I understand that the Church of England use heated seat cushions quite a lot, to apparently good effect. And I think also under pew heating is something that can be quite effective. Coming back to Roger's point about people keeping their feet warm, that can be quite successful.
Which is back to floors again, isn't it? So you have a decent floor that isn't leaching the heat from your feet, and then some way of keeping those feet warm. Your whole physiology is responding much better to the modest temperatures above.
Absolutely. John keeps asking about infrared heating. Have you had any experience with that?
Yeah, that's essentially the radiant things that I've mentioned. Although I think there are nuances on exactly which frequency of radiation you're using. Some of you will be familiar with the warehouse style heating, where you had gas pointing downwards, and the heaters I showed you pictures of for Kilmelford, and indeed some of the cottages, they essentially were infrared from the panels. There's a lot of it about. The thing with it is it's not free. You still have to pay for it, but they would argue that it delivers better heat physiologically.
Sounds good. There's a question from Andrea Price, which is about solar panels on A-listed roofs. Are they allowed? And what about replacing wire grids with police secondary glazing?
So the answer to that, and there's a following question about solar panels on B-listed churches as well. So I'll do both of those at the same time, and come to wire grills in a second. So I think with solar panels, it very much depends on the individual building. If you happen to have a south-facing roof that's reasonably well concealed, then we wouldn't have a particular problem about installing solar panels. If your roof is very prominent, then that probably isn't the right answer for that building. So it does very much depend. I think also in the Old Town Edinburgh Old Town World Heritage Site, there will be additional consideration, that I suppose, well, they're the same considerations, but would be even more rigorously applied, I think. So the short answer is yes, if you can fit solar panels in a way that means that they're not prominently visible, then that's probably likely to be acceptable. If all your south-facing roofs are on a prominent roof slope, then maybe think of maybe go for the air source heat pump instead. Coming on to the wire grills, I assume that you're asking about replacing wire grills with the sort of external secondary glazing that Roger showed in his slide. Is that correct? I don't know if the person who, Andrew, wants to clarify that.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. So I think, once again, it does depend slightly on the situation. I suppose both wire grills and external secondary glazing can come with a visual impact. And I suppose part of it is striking the balance between, or kind of deciding which one is the least damaging in visual terms. And I suppose also with the secondary glazing, there are also considerations about actually how that's fitted and how that's going to have an impact on the glass behind, because then you're potentially creating a sort of microclimate between the existing window and the secondary glazing, which Roger also touched on a bit earlier. So I think it's something that would be worth discussing with the planning department, and I think it's quite likely that it would be supported, but it would very much depend on the individual circumstance. I think sometimes a dark coloured grille can actually be less visually intrusive, but obviously isn't going to do anything for improving your thermal efficiency. But then there's maybe something that you can do inside the building instead of on the outside that might address that as well. So it's without knowing the individual building and kind of really thinking it through, it is very much a case by case sort of decision making. That, and also don't feel that the only place for solar panels is on a roof, because that's pretty hard to get to, very hard to maintain. Increases concentrating runoffs onto other areas of the roof, which might have technical implications. So they can be elsewhere. You can get solar slates. So if you have not a particularly special roof, you can actually replace the slates with solar slates, which aren't real slate, of course. They've got something clever in them. So there are many different options there. But again, it depends on your context. Roofs on churches are high up, big health and safety constraints on the work, which will add to the cost. But there maybe other options. I did notice a message in the chat about the Edinburgh consent there, which is unusual, because 15 years ago, Changeworks got permission in an M-shaped roof valley in Edinburgh for solar thermal as part of it's called renewable heritage. So I suspect that might develop. Edinburgh and indeed many tenements have roofs like that, and there are opportunities there. I'd be wrong to say there aren't. There definitely are.
We've got a really technical question here about insulating walls. If you're using thermofleece and hemp bats, is there a need to retain an air gap between the plasterboard and the sandstone wall?
There's different views on this. My view is we've done quite a lot of additional insulation work, and that the air gap is not necessary. It's a habit that the industry has done. I think possibly to protect themselves from a wall that might not be very happy. But actually, if you have a damp wall, you're not in the insulation space at all. You're in the business of getting that sorted out. There's a couple of case studies, Downey's Cottage case study, where we put insulation directly on insulated lime plaster on the hard, which was kind of in mimicry of the original plaster layer, which went on the hard too. So I think it's kind of varies. I wouldn't necessarily hold to it. And indeed, where we blow some materials in, as we did at Holyrood Park Lodge, where you saw some of the pictures, there was no longer an air gap. But the key with that one is that the building was working as it should. The wall was dry. The detailing that threw the rain away was top dollar. I think the air gap thing is with buildings that are suboptimal. But if that was the case, I wouldn't be insulating. I'd be sorting out the building. So I think it's an industry habit, which is not wrong, but not always necessary.
Okay. I think that's really all of our questions have been answered. I don't know if anybody else has a question that they particularly is burning they would like to ask tonight.
Just going to ask, could we have contact details if we wanted to contact either of you? Could they be made available?
Sure. Judith will have the details. Very
Yes.
happy to share, and
Yeah.
we do answer quite a lot of questions from the public, so that's fine.
Well, we'll send out a follow-up email to this event and we'll put the slides in with it. So you'll get all the details from the slides in that follow-up email. I'd be happy with that. So
that would be really useful. Thank you. I just, my question is, how do you get it past a congregation that have lost the will to live nearly, I think, because I'd love to get our congregation a little bit more empowered about the eco state of our church and things like that. But we've lost so many over the past few months, particularly after it was an elderly congregation anyway. So just pray for an input of young people with good ideas, I think.
Yeah, I mean that's my experience around here, is that it was an older congregation, and then the restrictions and all, the whole thing has meant that this scale of work is not on their radar right now.
Yeah.
So
yeah, they've got enough to do with getting to church on a Sunday morning, I think, at the moment, is not apart from anything else, which is sad, because our church is in such a good place as well. It's right on the main road to Clydebank and everything, and if we could get more people in there, it would be amazing. Or even if we could get I've said to them recently though, if you haven't got the energy to go out there and do it, at least pray, because I to encourage our older congregation members that they can at least do that, and that helps.
absolutely. We'll be praying for you too, Sarah.
Thank you.
So I think it just remains really to say thank you so much to both of you for coming along today, to Roger and to Louisa, because we've got so much information and so much to follow up from today's event. That's fantastic. So thank you both for giving your time today, and really delighted that you could come and share with us. And thank you to everybody else for coming along today.